Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Gentleman and we are here to do one thing and one thing only, and that is review Dragon Quest Your Story. The movie dropped on Netflix on February 13th, and I am here to guide you through this film that has good qualities but was very controversial in Japan for reasons we will see by the end. And for those wondering, I've run into a difficulty with my Dragon Quest IV analysis. So I do apologize, please expect that within the week. Anyway, to get to the movie, first we open with us being told that this is a Netflix original. Does Netflix simply slap their name onto everything they get their hands on? The movie proper begins with Super Famicom Japanese text explaining that Laja is attempting to free the Fiend Lord Dismo. I like that Dragon Quest V began with no clear concept of a main villain early on. I suppose this was to give viewers a basic plot to follow, but I do think they could have left this out and introduced this concept during the story. The subtitles use names from the DS translation rather than the Japanese names, which is fine as they'd be more recognizable to most modern Western players. The birth of the protagonist uses Super Famicom footage, which is great, but then most of the child section of the story is reduced to that. On top of this, it's so rushed that if you had never played the game, you'd easily miss they mention Bianca and the protagonist's adventures. Removing that part of the story also removes a lot of the attachment the viewer would gain towards Bianca, and it's also one of the best parts of the source material in general. Though I did like they added from the DS version that you see Nera from the beginning, and they even added in this hint that she has a crush on the protagonist. Also, they named the main character Luca, even though his official name is Madison, which I did find weird at first, but we will see the very odd reasons as to why they did this by the end. Finally getting into the animation, it is very Pixar. This was somewhat controversial in Japan as Toriyama's Bird Studios were not contracted to do the movie. That said, for most of the film, and I emphasize most, it looks really good and it works. It's very shocking at first and you're not used to seeing the characters this way, but you do get used to it. The movie handles Luca meeting the mysterious man quite well, concealing just enough of him so that you don't see who he is. Koberg has been given a more elaborate design, which I thought was a neat change. The arrogant young Harry is done well enough, though it immediately cuts to him being kidnapped, which is unfortunate. I thought they could have included the little scenario where he tries to trick the protagonist in. We then cut right to Pancraz and Luca attempting to rescue Harry, but are caught by Laja and his two goons. Laja himself does look very Uncanny Valley. He almost looks like claymation. For the most part, they managed to make him threatening enough, though at certain moments they don't let his villainy have any time to breathe and really allow you to feel the impact of his viciousness. That said, Pancraz's death is done very well. It's actually shocking how graphic they made him being hit by that Kafrizzle attack. Overall, as I implied, the childhood part is very rushed. There's no time to let anything breathe, and we don't really get to see how the protagonist becomes braver and stronger, which was one of the highlights of the source material. Getting into the adult section of the story, they did characterize Luca and Harry very differently. In fact, their first lines almost felt like clumsy reintroductions to them, with Harry having to remind you that he likes being called a prince. It's almost as if they thought we'd be too stupid to recognize who they were. This also removes the growth that Harry had, where in the games he blamed himself for what happened to your father, which had caused him to grow up. I did love the design of the slave quarry, however, with that spiral path going up the mountain. And I have to say, the music is utterly fantastic, though it is Sugiyama's symphonic score, so I suppose that's another way of saying it's great they didn't mess with what already worked. The monsters really benefit from this art style. The orcs, for example, look really great. The entire story about escaping with Maria has been cut out, understandably so with the runtime. The escape in barrels has been changed slightly to be played for laughs, with Luca and Harry pretending to be dead, and it was a neat little joke. So I'm ultimately fine with that, despite it removing the greater sense of danger from the games. When the two leave the barrels, monsters find them and a chase ensues. You'll be hearing me say this a lot, but the movies are really well directed in this film. They're dynamic, they're always shot in an interesting way, and they always manage to be fun. It's sort of weird that there's a human town near the slave quarry. I assume they all adhere to the Cult of Light, but then again, the Cult of Light is never mentioned in the movie at all. The duo are kept safe by Dr. Aegon, and you know, whoever was doing the subtitles should have spelled out the word doctor as it becomes obvious who this is. In the source material, no one was expecting who his true identity was, and you meet him fairly late into the game, so you're not really going to suspect his identity. but here it just comes off as clumsy and hilarious. The story is then streamlined so that rather than wandering about, Luca and Harry directly head back to Coburg where Harry decides to stay. The farewell with him, again, really shows how nothing is allowed to breathe because there is so much to cover in such a short amount of time, so it's really hard to feel the impact of this scene. Luca returns home and very conveniently happens to pull on a rope to uncover his father's secret room, which contains his notes. It was hilariously bad, considering you need to ask yourself, who hides a secret room with the largest rope that anyone can see? Pancraz's notes mention Luca's father, Mata, whose power is simplified to simply knowing a spell that would open the Dark Realm. This felt simplified for anyone who has not played the games, which is really weird, as we're going to see by the end of this that this movie really only wants to appeal to those who played the games. Pancraz apparently always believed Luca was the hero, which I did not like. They still go for the subversion later on, but in the game there was a greater sense of mystery by everyone not having any clue who the hero could be. Pancraz also had the Zenithian sword in his secret area by this point. We read that he despaired that he could not wield it, and there was a great bit of storytelling with Luca not being able to wield it at this point, which all added to the mystery of the story. But they decided to push that off to later, and we're going to see that they do it in a way that I did not like. One thing that I really hated about this movie is how they changed the protagonist's motivations. In the original, it's implied he's bravely setting out to find his mother, with the tension coming from the fact that he has no clues and how great of a challenge this is. But here they made him feel overly scared in a way that made him feel like a 12-year-old protagonist of a Western animation kid film. Once he does decide to go, we get a montage of his journey. Some of it has some pretty good action. The part with him trying to fight the metal slimes was legitimately funny, though rather than a king slime falling on him, I would have just let him finally beat one while the others ran away, as that would have just been extremely relatable. Up until now, a slime has been following him who he names Gertrude, which is true to the games. The part with the golems chasing him, however, is one of those moments that is really trying too hard to look like a Pixar comedy moment, and it stands out. And you can tell by this point that they may be going a little too far with the comedy. I don't mind some levity. In fact, it's necessary. And as I've mentioned, some of the jokes up until now do land. But Dragon Quest V was a game where you role-played someone who was deeply affected by the events he's been through. A man who has had to deal with a lot in his young life. And I feel like up until now, none of that has been really true to the character. Anyway, he encounters Percy, his saber cat, in another moment that's played for laughs. And it's sort of a funny joke with him running beside them rather than jumping on them. But again, it's another moment that was dramatic in the source material that's been sacrificed for comedy. The city they reach has been ravaged by Bajorn, which means they took the two stories that take place in this town and combined them into one for streamlining. Which does make sense for the time constraints. One thing done really well is how they do Nera's love at first sight moment. In the games, it's not done very well and people even forget that it exists. But here it's more explicit and it leaves more of an impact. Rather than searching for the two rings, defeating Bajorn will earn that person Nera's hand in marriage. Again, I don't like how they made Luca overly scared here. It's really distracting. They could have done plenty of other things to give him character. Luca and Nera have a short, cute, though somewhat trite scene, but they do surprisingly make it work. And I'm actually rather convinced that he has some feelings for her. But they follow it up with, again, a Western animation comedy style moment with them being beaten by Bajorn. It simply doesn't fit. At the pub, he ends up running into Bianca. They do that whole thing where the female is somewhat more confident than the protagonist, and again it doesn't feel like it's true to either character, nor does the overall bossiness fit in with what I think of when it comes to Bianca. One thing I did love is how the movie portrayed skills. Usually adaptations tend not to be faithful in how attacks look and work, but they did a fantastic job here. Bianca using the Frizzle line of spells and Luca using the Whoosh line always looked really good in action. Luca and Bianca confront Bajorn, which leads to a huge action scene and a chase, which both were really dynamically directed. Despite having a Pixar art style, the ideas for action scenes do have that anime penchant for more original cinematography. And it was great how Gertrude dressed up as Luca to distract Bajorn, while Luca blasted his wings and put a sword to his eye. When Bajorn asks if Luca is going to kill him, he says, "That depends on you, Bajorn," which was very cool. A nice touch also was how Luca's eyes became a signifier for his power to convince monsters. Two things, however. 1. I didn't like how Luca only convinced 3 monsters by the end. I would have loved if in montages we see him convincing monsters to join in over time, and by the end, he builds up a small army. That said, the fact that he did persuade Bjorn in this version unlike the original is pretty cool. My second issue is what I referred to with the Zenithian sword before. His inability to use it in the original played up a sense of mysteriousness, but here again it's unfortunately played up for a comedic moment. I often wondered to myself if that they were hoping this would resonate upon an international release, and decided to take comedic cues from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Bianca eggs on Luca to propose, and we get a pretty cliche moment of him just barely getting the words out, but afterwards comes an addition that I have mixed feelings about. We receive a fairly long sequence of an old lady giving Luca a drink that makes him realize he really loves Bianca in his dreams. A very video game looking dream, mind you, which we'll get to later. I really feel as if they could have and should have showed this occurring more naturally. In fact, they sort of began to with how he tells Nera how great Bianca is. But rather than the writing following through on it, they did this instead. The old lady does turn out to be Nera using Morph, which does say a lot about how selfless she is, since she wanted Luca to follow how he truly felt. But still, this all takes away from what could have been better storytelling. On top of that, it takes up a lot of time that could have been given to allow other scenes to breathe. Bianca's drinking scene is another which feels really odd, and is not what I think of when it comes to the character. That said, the moment when Luca proposes to her, being more natural at it compared to when he proposed to Nera, is admittedly a great payoff for the specific story they were going for here. And the moment where Bianca stood up straight, embarrassed, upon being proposed to, was admittedly a great reversal for what they were going on here, since she was the one trying to get him to propose to Nera before, and was cringing at his inability to do so. Because of how events were ordered differently, rather than putting on Luca and Bianca's wedding, Briscoletti has a falling out with him. I think they could have told the story they wanted without this, however. In the games, Briscoletti arranging the wedding no matter who you chose was a symbolic signifier that Bianca and Nera, and Deborah, were all actually orphan sisters adopted by different families. But I suppose the movie isn't concerned with the lore. The entire story of Pancras having been a king is, surprisingly enough, cut from the movie. Luca and Bianca simply live in Luca's old home. Their son is born, and for time constraints, the daughter is cut out of the movie. I'm sorry, kid. We remember you in our hearts. Luca decides he is going to continue his search for the hero after his son is born. And then Ladja, who needs a way of convincing Mara to unlock the Dark Realm, has deliberately gone searching for him. The order of events are kind of awkward. I won't go in depth here, but the order of events in the games felt a lot more natural. With the protagonist and his wife adventuring, she gets pregnant, and what the protagonist does after. The choice to say, hey, my kid was just born, time to leave, just felt like a weird choice, so I'm almost kind of thankful Ladja showed up and ruined those plans. Anyway, the revelation about Bianca's lineage is not played up as strongly here, as she's simply a Zenithian and not the descendant of the past legendary hero. But even the scenes dealing with this aren't paced or directed in a way that really plays up the revelation either. This is unfortunate because this surprise was one of the best parts of the source material. Anyway, the action scene of the monsters chasing down Luca and Bianca is very good, and the moment where Bianca is hit by Kasnooze is really nice looking, as is the moment when they use petrification on Luca. The following scene shows Bianca is a Zenithian due to her eye color. So basically they made Luca a Zenithian and his powers to convince animals a Zenithian power. Whereas originally it was a power gained from his mother, who came from a completely different people. The entire point originally was the protagonist had no relation to the hero or any Zenithian. So by making them both Zenithians, it really takes away from the uniqueness of how Dragon Quest V really handled its hero. Ladja, after being unable to convince Bianca for help, turns her to stone. In the original context it made sense. They were trying to prevent the hero's birth. But in this context it doesn't work. Since all it takes is a Zenithian to unlock the Dark Realm, it's actually quite nonsensical that they would do this to her. Perhaps I'm remembering it incorrectly, maybe Mata is the only one who's powerful enough to in this version, but still in the way it plays out, Bianca would still be more useful unpetrified rather than being turned to stone. Anyway, something that I did like was that while Luca is stone, the world begins to break down more and more around him. It was a really interesting way of portraying the changing world. and while not as poetic as what the game did, it does certainly have merits of its own. Luca and Bianca's son Alice arrives with the rod to free Luca. They removed Alice's Super Saiyan hair, but I guess that's to be expected. The moment where Luca accidentally passes the Zenithian sword to Alice is a kind of a dumb concept. But the Zenithian sword itself, however, looks really great in this version. I love the way it opens up when it's unsheathed, and they found a way to make its power feel really palpable against the Gigantes. The crew goes to find Dr. Aegon in hope of finding the Zenithian dragon who is in disguise. And of course, by the beginning, we've all known that Dr. Aegon is the Zenithian dragon. Rather than an orb that allowed Zenithia to fly, what he's lost is a dragon orb that allows him to transform. So I guess we're Fire Emblem now. Luca must find the fairies to figure out what to do. This feels a little shoehorned into the movie. In the source material, he went to the fairies world as a kid, so when he returns as an adult, it feels more natural. Whereas here it's like, well, it's time to go to the fairy world. I'm sure those fairies can help. Luca must now engage in a trial, and I felt very disappointed that his son didn't accompany him. The whole fun of this section in the games was that you're traveling with your children, and it feels like the writer and director didn't understand that. Anyway, the time travel stuff is handled in a very unnatural way. In the original, Ladja crushed the orb, making the time travel necessary. In this version, the entire thing is written in a really awkward way. It's hard to describe the problem with it offhand, but it feels like they were trying really hard to force in a time travel story, rather than creating a necessary scenario for a time travel moment to exist. And I didn't think this problem was necessary. They simply could have shown Ladja crushing the orb in this version as well. It would have taken all about 5 seconds. Anyway, they do this thing where Luca tells his younger self a line about marriage he should remember, which essentially creates a minor time loop. And while Dragon Quest has always done time travel, and has done interesting things with it, it usually doesn't do any of the timey-wimey time loop sort of thing, so I just found that sort of odd. Anyway, with Aegon able to transform into the Zenithian dragon, they begin their assault on Ladja's mountain. Bianca is freed, and thus begins the final battle. The final fight, like most of the action scenes, is really well done, and this is legitimately one of the best in a Pixar animation style that I've ever seen. And I admit that I'll probably watch it again. In fact, my only regret is that it wasn't longer. I like that Bianca used the oomph spell to buff her husband and son to support them. Usually support skills don't make it into adaptations of anything fantasy, so I thought that it was fantastic that it made it in here. And while I'm fine with Bajorn showing up, he was a monster persuaded by Luca's power, I would have gone along with Harry not showing up and letting our heroes wage war. Again, we already had a great action scene going on to begin with. Ladja faking his death while Luca attempts to stab him when he's really using a barrier close to his body was a very nice little fake out. And it did feel satisfying when Alice jumped in and both of them delivered the final blow together. And as Alice throws the Zenithian sword up to close the entrance to the Dark Realm, a huge digital virus thing comes through, and this is where the movie decides to get dumb. Now, up until now, the movie hadn't been perfect, and it had its share of issues. But it had its enjoyable moments and it was certainly watchable. But here, at the end, it decides to get really stupid. The most un-Dragon Quest kind of sort of Tron monster thing shows up. He deletes the Zenithian sword and begins to undo everything else. The thing turns out to be a virus, and by him saying "grow up loser," we can tell the person who made it was some kind of edgy teenager. I like the concept of someone messing with texture mapping and collision detection in a movie or a show, and it would work in some kind of Tron spin-off, but not here. Moreover, the execution feels like a story about the internet and viruses and mainframes that would have been at home in the 90s, long before anyone really understood the internet, but in the end this is something nobody wanted. On top of that, a lot of the earlier decisions, such as the drink that allowed Luca to have a very digital dream, as well as the protagonist being named Luca rather than Madison, all stem from the idea that this is actually a giant VR game. What this means is that so many of the other less than stellar decisions were informed by this. Truth be told, the entire thing is well-intentioned. I get what they're trying to say about how Dragon Quest is not just a game, that it's another reality we experience and is a part of our lives. But it's done in the most haphazard, cringy, cliche, and un-Dragon Quest way ever. I think they could have honored the franchise simply by having made a great adaptation. Gutru turns out to be the antivirus program, which means he wasn't even following Luca because of his power. The antivirus takes the form of the Sword of Erdrick, and the virus is defeated. Again, it's awkward since why does the antivirus need to be armed from within the game? This could work again in a story where the characters are within the program like Tron, but not here where the player is using an in-game avatar. The movie at least has the decency to resume the story afterwards. But then it's shoved down our throats that Luca is the true hero. This is weird considering the point of the original is that your place as a husband, father of the hero, king, and leader of the group was sufficient and compelling enough while your son was the hero. It seems to ultimately miss the point of the original story. The ending was extremely controversial in Japan and soured many people's opinions on it, and quite frankly I can easily see why. Before I conclude, I just want to mention how far Ladja has come from a villain. In the original, he died about 4/5 way into the game and then the Archbishop and Nismo took over. In the DS version, Ladja was played up a lot more to the point he became the penultimate boss. And here he's practically the main villain, and it's no surprise why. He's so interconnected with the high points of the game and has become such a clear face of what true evil is in these games. Overall, the movie minus the last 10 minutes is decent enough. It's got fun moments, the action scenes are great, the animation is fluid, the art style does end up working, and I did like some of the elements of the love triangle, and it's worth watching just for the sake of it if you already have Netflix. However, there are plenty of issues with the movie. Many of the changes, especially to character, don't work, and about half the comedy is just straight up unnecessary. To the point it hurts certain scenes and characters. A lot of the scenes are harmed directly or indirectly by what they had to cut out. While yes, certain things had to be changed for the runtime, so many of them are done without elegance. Truly, the entire concept of turning a 30 to 40 hour game into a single movie is questionable. Cutting out so much of the childhood was a pretty large mistake in and of itself. At the very least, they should have done 2 movies, the first one ending with the marriage between Madison and Bianca, and at best they should have done a trilogy. But in the end, this is what we got. Oh, and by the way, the ending sucks. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please stay tuned next week for my analysis of Dragon Quest IV. Please like and comment if you can, subscribe if you haven't already. If you wish to support the channel, you may do so for as low as $1 a month on Patreon. Please like, comment, and share if you can. Thank you for watching, and God bless you all.